You talk in this video about medical coercion. Can you define what that means to you?
It's interesting. So I was doing a little piece on this the other day on coercion and compliance. And if you look at the etymology of the words, they have something to do with, um, you know, uh, acting on the basis of someone else's will. And I think that's really interesting, right? So when you make a decision or you act or something even is done to you, not and it doesn't come from your own reasoning, your own decision making capacities, but you're doing it because of some impetus from somebody else. Maybe they're giving you an ultimatum. So these vaccine mandates are a kind of coercive immunization strategy, right? The ultimatum is you take you provide proof of vaccination, or you get fired, or you're put on unpaid leave, or you lose your place in school, or you can't get on a plane, right? So they're presented as a kind of ultimatum, usually, whether that ultimatum is explicit or implicit. And so it's the imposition of the other person placing that ultimatum on you, placing their will on you, that makes you decide in one way rather than another, when in the absence of that coercion, you would not make that choice, right?
When those who would uh, would argue in favor of, uh, I guess the opposite, would argue in favor of your or anyone else getting the vaccine, and they say, "Well, your will is being imposed on us because we believe that," as we often hear, regardless of what the science may say, that, uh, "Okay, well, you're saying my will doesn't have a right to infringe on yours, but does your will have a right to infringe on mine?" That's what I hear, and then we just go back and forth playing this
Yeah.
match of, you know, really, politics, I think, in a lot of ways, not necessarily science, right? So how do you respond when people say that?
Yeah, so I think to give a full answer to this question, or a full-ish answer to this question, we need to get into the area of science. And as a medical ethicist, having a background in medical ethics and not being a virologist or an immunologist myself, I try to pay pretty close attention to the scientific evidence we're getting, but I need to do my best to understand it. But one thing that a lot of the immunologists and virologists are telling us in Canada, and I think we're seeing this confirmed now by the director of the CDC and by Fauci and the chief medical advisor in the UK and many, many other people, is that the set of COVID vaccines is not working quite as well as they thought. They're starting to admit this, right? Why is that? Well, because they still allow transmission. So it still allows for, if you get the vaccine, it's still possible for you to contract COVID, and it's still possible for you to transmit it to somebody else, right? And so the term for that among immunologists is that the vaccine is non-sterilizing, right? So if it's possible for you still to get sick and get symptomatic and to transmit it to somebody else, then it's a non-sterilizing vaccine. And so or leaky is the other term, which is kind of more fun, but so I think the ethical implications of that are that if the vaccine was sterilizing, right? So that if you took it, it was impossible for you to get COVID, that it doesn't matter what anybody else does, right? Because if no one else on the planet got vaccinated and the COVID vaccine was sterilizing, then you got vaccinated, then you would be immune. You would be totally protected, right? Based on my understanding. So the problem, I take it, is that the thinking is that the COVID vaccines are non-sterilizing. So it does matter what other people do, right? So I take it those on the other side will say, well, the fact that you are not vaccinated increases the likelihood that I will contract COVID from you, even though I'm vaccinated. What is not clear to me, though, is whether or not someone else being vaccinated actually does reduce your chance of contracting COVID from them. So I think that the science it's very quickly evolving. The narrative around the science in terms of transmission is very quickly evolving. I think we're seeing a lot of inconsistency in terms of what our public health officials in Canada and in the States have said and are saying now about how much these vaccines are really protecting you. How many boosters do you need in order to be protected? And will a certain number of them actually make you immune to this illness. And so, I think this question about whether or not one person is a threat to another, one person is a viral vector, a viral threat to another person, it depends on how good these vaccines are. And I think the proof is in the pudding, and the pudding isn't looking very good, right?
Would you have a different take on the ethics of all of this if they were? In other words, does that change the game? Because I've heard different people say, even still, there should be a very high bar or non-existent to force somebody into a medical treatment that they do not want. I'm just curious what you think about that.
It's really interesting question. So I wrote a declaration for a case, a mandate case. I can't say very much about it, but recently. And one of the challenges for me was to explain under what conditions a vaccine mandate would be justified. And so I thought about this for a number of days, and then I was jotting down all these notes. I thought, well, in order for it to be justified, you'd have to have a highly virulent pathogen. There would have to be no available treatment options, which I don't think is the case in our COVID situation. The vaccines would have to be demonstrably safe and effective, things like that. And then in the end, I ended up basically scrapping all of that and saying, even if those things were true, which they're not in the COVID case, in my view, even if that might make a mandate more justifiable than it is, it's not clear to me that that any mandated medical treatment is ever ethically justified, right? It's not clear to me that it's ever, that the thing you're gaining by mandating a medical intervention is more valuable than what you've lost by mandating it, which is people's right to do what they want with their body, because they're the ones who are, what goes into my body, I'm the one who's going to deal with the consequences of that. No one else will, even if there's some sort of, financial compensation for harms that I suffer. Money and your health are incommensurable goods. There's no amount of money that can compensate for a loss of your health or a loss of your life or a loss of time spent with your loved ones, for example.
Having listened to a wide variety of opinions on this one, many of which align, I think, in the corporate legacy news sector or the government sector versus those who are speaking kind of on the outside, it seems like it depends on where you put your level of risk. Is your risk on protecting civil liberties, at the risk of, allowing people, I guess, to take personal responsibility and personal risk? Or do you look at the collective and say, I'd rather take the risk with civil liberties in the locking them down for the benefit of the community? And wherever somebody falls on that line, it seems like they're a little bit more or less accepting of mandates for whatever reason. The establishment narrative at this point, the one that we're allowed to discuss on the tech platforms or on the corporate news, is risking the civil liberties for the benefit of the community. So I'm curious, as you're somebody who's speaking against that, not necessarily against protecting the community, because obviously you've already cited science that would support your position that you're not putting the community at risk. But as you're deviating from that narrative that I think is still perpetuated by a lot of people, what kind of reaction have you gotten both from your peers or is that a message that's difficult to deliver? Say right now we're live on my ROKFIN platform and this whole conversation is going to go on my other platforms. But when people watch it on YouTube, I'm probably going to be slicing this up, right? So that the whole thing doesn't get wiped altogether. And I should say, if you're watching this on YouTube later, why? You should be going to my other platforms. The links are in the description where you can see my entire talk with Dr. Ponesse. But I'm just curious because it's not an easy time right now to say what you've said so far.
Really, okay, there's a lot in there, right? One thing that is, probably the two biggest criticisms I've got lately are this collectivist good one and the privilege argument. So I in terms of the collective good, I mean, this has been going on for a long months and months for most of the pandemic, right? So the idea that you don't have rights anymore, your rights don't matter, personal freedoms don't matter when they come at the cost of the collective good. I think about this a lot, so what is the collective good anyway, right? What is a collective and how is something good or bad for it? So if by the collective we mean a group of people and whether or not that's the people who live kind of in your immediate area, maybe it's the people in your country, but now given globalization, it's really everybody in the world, right? So when I think when those on the kind of pro narrative say that do your part. I don't know if that's a slogan you have in the States. Is it? That's a big part of our Canadian messaging. Do your part. And
Yeah, it's
yeah,
I
okay.
most, if not all of the messaging has been around that because
Mhm.
how can you force a mandate if you can't get people to believe that
They're
their
helping.
actions have a direct
Mhm.
result or consequence for somebody else? Otherwise, it's just you're taking the risk for yourself, right? And why would you
Yeah.
mandate that? Even though it's becoming clearer and clearer that that really is what it is. We've heard the CDC director say very clearly, like, hey, you should still be wearing a mask inside
Mhm.
because you could transmit it if you get the vaccine. I, even still, it's still being sold that way.
It's really interesting though because what you said there a couple sentences ago that you should do your part and get the vaccine for someone else. That's even different than talking about get the vaccine for the sake of the public good. Right?
Mhm.
So getting vaccinated so that you can protect the health of other particular people, at least, I mean, if the science was right, that would make some kind of virological and maybe ethical sense, right? But this language of doing your part for the sake of the collective is weird in my mind because a group doesn't experience um, sort of benefits and harms in the way that an individual does, right? So, a really simple example if you have a headache, you, the individual, is the one who feels the pain of the headache. And if there's a treatment for that headache, you take some Tylenol, for example, it's the individual who takes the Tylenol and then the individual who experiences relief. So, I mean, I don't mean to be overly individualistic or atomistic and not recognizing the ways that we are connected to other human beings in society. And I don't mean to disparage the importance of things like empathy or caring for other people or altruism, but I think it's important for us to realize what's at stake when we limit or even negate altogether individual rights for the sake of the collective. And we have to start asking these questions. What does it mean to do something good for a group? What does it mean to do something good for society? Does it mean that the human race will last longer? Does it mean that most people on the planet will live better? Does it come down to the gross national product? What does it mean for a group of people to be doing well or flourishing? And it's not clear to me that those questions are as easy to answer when we're talking about the group as when we're talking about individuals. And if they're not easy to
Mhm.
answer, and if there's a good reason for that, because good does not pertain to the group in the same way that it pertains to the individual, we're starting to lose our footing in terms of justifying mandates imposed on individuals for the sake of the good of the group. Right? That makes sense.
Yes, it does. Somebody on ROKFIN says, JVB says, "The collective interest is severely harmed by the loss of individual freedom." I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Philosophers John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who were really the fathers of utilitarianism, which is, I think, the starting point in modern history for this collectivist idea, right? That we should act so as to produce as much good as possible. Even they, I mean, Jeremy Bentham is very well known for having vigorously, adamantly defended certain kinds of individual rights, like freedom of expression and women's rights, and laws against slavery and things like that, because they recognize that preserving rights for individuals is ultimately better for the group. So if you think about two different worlds, one in which you have no freedom of speech, no women's rights, and slave ownership is possible, and then you have another world in which you're still worried about promoting the good and creating as much happiness for as many people as possible. But in that world, you have a kind of rule utilitarianism. So you're protecting individual rights by adopting certain sorts of rules. So we say, well, we're still worried about happiness, but we're going to make sure that we protect individuals' rights to free speech and women's rights and things like that. So I think that whoever made that comment, I think that's really insightful, because you can just turn the argument on its head and say, well, if it sometimes is important to focus on the individual for the sake of the collective good, then we can also use that reasoning, or that principle, we might call it, right, in order to show that protecting rights and not infringing on them is arguably just as good as, if not better than, for the good, right? So I think that's a really insightful comment.
Don't forget, you can support my work with a great gift idea for the holidays, and there are two options to toast free speech while you watch my videos. The first is AllisonWinePromo.com. That's Allison with one L, winepromo.com. You get 50% off some of my favorite Malbecs from the high altitude regions of Argentina. They use no flavoring, no filtering, no dyes, and no excess chemicals. And not only do you get 50% off the wine itself, but you get 50% off shipping. Now, if you'd like your holiday toast to free speech to be over a hot cup of coffee, or actually a cold brew Caturra tea, which is tea made from the coffee fruits, check out my other sponsor, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison, twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. These are high altitude, shade grown, USDA certified organic Nicaraguan roasts. And the founder and CEO of the company lives right there in Nicaragua, where they grow, harvest, and roast the coffee. So wherever you are this holiday season, definitely check out my sponsors and toast to free speech.